The man who directed this cheerful, family-friendly space adventure had, just a few years earlier, terrorized audiences as one of the most frightening killers in movie history. That is only the first surprise. This is The Last Starfighter, the 1984 film about a trailer park teenager who becomes the best in the world at an arcade game, only to discover the game was secretly a test, and that aliens have recruited him to fight a real war in space. Behind its wholesome charm sits a genuine technological revolution that helped change movies forever. Today, we count down 20 weird facts about it and stick around for number 1. The reason this humble film still matters. Subscribe if you love 80s science fiction. Let's get into it. Let us start with the surprise from the intro because it is a genuinely jarring one. The Last Starfighter is a warm, optimistic, almost innocent film, the kind of hopeful adventure that makes you feel good about the world. Its director, Nick Castle, has a rather darker claim to fame that seems impossible to reconcile with it. Just 6 years earlier, in 1978, Nick Castle physically played the killer Michael Myers, credited as The Shape in John Carpenter's landmark horror film Halloween. That is right. The man behind the camera on this gentle space fantasy was the man behind the mask of one of cinema's most terrifying boogeymen, silently stalking Jamie Lee Curtis through the suburbs of Haddonfield. Castle was an old film school friend of Carpenter's, and playing The Shape was essentially a favor to his buddy that turned into an iconic piece of horror history. From embodying pure, wordless evil to directing a movie about a good-hearted kid saving the galaxy is one of the strangest career pivots imaginable, and it belongs to the same quiet man. Castle was never really a horror actor at all, which makes it stranger still. He was a writer and aspiring director who happened to be on hand, and Carpenter simply asked him to put on the pale mask and drift through the background of certain shots. Castle gave The Shape its distinctive, unhurried, almost floating walk, a physical choice that helped define one of horror's most imitated monsters. And then he quietly moved on to tell warmer, more hopeful stories like this one. The heart and soul of The Last Starfighter is Centauri, the charming, fast-talking alien recruiter who lures young Alex into the cosmos. Played with irresistible, twinkle-eyed showmanship by the veteran actor Robert Preston. For audiences of a certain age, Preston was a beloved legend, and his role here carried a bittersweet weight that many younger viewers missed entirely. The Last Starfighter was Robert Preston's final theatrical film role, a fitting and affectionate send-off for one of the great charmers of American entertainment, and the part was no accident. The character of Centauri, a lovable con man who talks a nervous young man into believing in something bigger, was written specifically with Preston in mind as a direct, knowing nod to his single most famous role, the silver-tongued swindler, Professor Harold Hill in the classic musical The Music Man. Preston essentially reprised his most iconic character in alien form as his farewell to the big screen. He died just 3 years later in 1987, which makes his warm, glowing performance here feel like a genuine goodbye. The premise of The Last Starfighter practically demanded a real arcade game tie-in. The whole movie is about a kid mastering a game called Starfighter, so naturally, a video game version was planned to capitalize on the film. And the end credits of the movie confidently direct viewers with the line, "Video game available from Atari Inc." There was just one problem. That game was never actually released. Atari did develop a Starfighter game, but the real thing proved too ambitious and expensive for its own good. The sophisticated arcade cabinet the concept required would reportedly have cost arcade owners around $10,000 in 1984, an enormous sum, and with the film performing only modestly at the box office, Atari decided it was not worth the risk and canceled the game before it was finished. A planned home version was axed too, so audiences sat through the credits being told to go buy a game that did not and would never exist. The abandoned work was not entirely wasted, however, as it was reportedly reworked and eventually released as different games, Solaris and Star Raiders 2. There is a lovely irony buried in the whole saga. The film is about a video game so advanced it is secretly alien technology, and in real life, the actual game proved too advanced and too expensive for the technology of its day to profitably deliver to arcades. The fiction outran reality. Decades later, dedicated fans and programmers finally built playable versions of the Starfighter game themselves. At last, giving the world the arcade cabinet the movie had promised but Atari never shipped. Blink during the trailer park scenes and you will miss a future star at the very beginning of his career. Appearing in a small, easy-to-overlook role as one of the neighborhood kids is a young Will Wheaton, credited simply as Louie's friend, years before he would become a household name. Just 2 years later, Wheaton would star in the beloved coming-of-age classic Stand By Me, and shortly after that, he would join the cast of Star Trek: The Next Generation as Wesley Crusher, becoming one of the most recognizable young faces in science fiction television. But in 1984, he was just another kid actor picking up a bit part in a trailer park sci-fi movie. It is a delightful piece of trivia, the sort of blink and you miss it early credit that so many stars have tucked away in their filmographies. The Last Starfighter quietly captured a future icon of nerd culture before almost anyone knew his name. The spacecraft in The Last Starfighter, especially the sleek, powerful Gunstar that Alex pilots into battle, are genuinely memorable pieces of design, and they came from one of the most quietly influential artists in Hollywood history. The ships were designed by the legendary concept artist Ron Cobb, whose fingerprints are on an astonishing number of beloved films. Cobb was a true titan of production design and conceptual art. Among his many credits, he helped design the look of the alien world and derelict ship in Ridley Scott's Alien, contributed creature and background designs to the famous cantina sequence in the original Star Wars, worked on Raiders of the Lost Ark and Conan the Barbarian, and even designed the time circuit modifications for the DeLorean in Back to the Future. Having an artist of Cobb's caliber shape the vehicles was a huge part of why The Last Starfighter looks so much more expensive and imaginative than its modest budget might suggest. The Gunstar earned its place among memorable movie ships thanks to one of the genre's greatest visual minds. Cobb's genius was making imaginary technology feel used, functional, and real, and that sensibility is all over the Gunstar, with its twin cockpits, its bristling weapons, and its famous last resort attack, the Death Blossom, a spinning burst of fire in every direction. Cobb brought a working engineer's logic to fantastical machines, and even rendered in the primitive computer graphics of 1984. His designs give the ships a solidity and believability that helped sell the whole ambitious digital experiment to audiences. One of the film's most endearing characters is Grig, the wise reptilian alien co-pilot who becomes Alex's loyal partner in the Gunstar, brought to life through elaborate makeup and a warm performance by the distinguished actor Dan O'Herlihy. O'Herlihy was a genuine heavyweight, and his presence lent the film real gravitas beneath all that latex. O'Herlihy had been a respected actor for decades, having even earned an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor back in 1954 for The Adventures of Robinson Crusoe. But for many modern viewers, his most recognizable role came just a few years after The Last Starfighter, when he played the sinister, powerful corporate executive known only as the Old Man, the chairman of the villainous OCP Corporation, in Paul Verhoeven's ultra-violent 1987 classic RoboCop. So, the gentle, lovable alien mentor guiding a teenager through the stars was, just 3 years later, the cold face of dystopian corporate greed. O'Herlihy also appeared in Halloween 3, tying him, like director Nick Castle, to that horror franchise. When Alex leaves Earth to fight in space, the aliens send a duplicate of him back home, an android substitute called a beta unit, to cover for his absence and keep his family and girlfriend from panicking. The comedic misadventures of this clumsy robot double form one of the film's most charming subplots, and here is the clever part. Both Alex and his robotic doppelganger are played by the same actor, Lance Guest. Guest pulled double duty throughout the production, portraying both the earnest, anxious hero Alex Rogan and the endearingly awkward beta android attempting to impersonate him on Earth. He crafted two distinct performances, giving the beta unit a slightly stiff, offbeat, not quite human quality that makes the character genuinely funny and lovable, clearly different from the real Alex. Pulling off scenes where a character interacts with his own duplicate required careful filmmaking and a committed dual performance. And Guest sold both halves so well that many casual viewers never quite register that the sweet, bumbling robot and the brave young pilot are the very same actor. The beta unit subplot also gives the film much of its charm and its stakes, as the malfunctioning android back on Earth slowly becomes a target for an alien assassin sent to eliminate Alex. Guest had to make the robot lovable enough that audiences would fear for it while still keeping it recognizably artificial, a genuinely tricky balancing act for a young actor early in his career. He went on to appear in films including Jaws, The Revenge, and tying him yet again to that horror lineage, Halloween 2. The Last Starfighter is quietly packed with actors who would go on to notable genre fame, and one of the most fun to spot is tucked into a tiny early role. Appearing briefly as a hitchhiker is the actor Mark Alimo. In a blink, and you miss it part that gives no hint of the memorable villain he would later become. Alimo would go on to science fiction immortality as Gul Dukat, the cunning, charismatic, and deeply menacing cardinal antagonist on Star Trek Deep Space Nine, widely regarded as one of the greatest and most complex villains in all of Star Trek. His Dukat is a landmark of television villainy, layered and genuinely unsettling. To find him here, years earlier, thumbing a ride in a small role in a family space adventure is a treat for genre fans. Between Alemo and Will Wheaton, The Last Starfighter managed to capture two future Star Trek actors near the very start of their journeys, hidden in its margins. Like most major science fiction films of its era, The Last Starfighter received a paperback novelization to tie in with its release, and the credits even encourage audiences to, quote, read the Berkeley book. What many people do not realize is that this tie-in was written by one of the most prolific and respected authors in the entire genre. The novelization was penned by Alan Dean Foster, a genuine giant of science fiction publishing. Foster is famous, among many other things, for ghostwriting the very first Star Wars novelization, the book that was credited to George Lucas, as well as writing an original Star Wars sequel novel and the acclaimed novelizations of the Alien films. He built a large part of his career elevating movie tie-in books into genuinely worthwhile reads. Having an author of his stature handle the Last Starfighter novelization meant the book was far more than a cheap cash-in, expanding on the story and characters with real craft. It is a reminder of how much talent quietly went into every corner of this production. We are halfway through the galaxy, and the 10 biggest facts are still ahead, including the room-sized supercomputer that made this movie possible. If you are enjoying this trip back to 1984, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me the first arcade game you ever loved. Alright, back to the stars. Nick Castle's connection to horror master John Carpenter went far deeper than just wearing the Michael Myers mask as a favor. The two had been close friends since their days together at film school at the University of Southern California, and their creative partnership produced more than just a slasher icon. Castle actually co-wrote the screenplay for one of Carpenter's most beloved films, the 1981 dystopian action classic Escape from New York, the movie that introduced the world to the legendary anti-hero Snake Plissken, played by Kurt Russell. Castle shares the writing credit with Carpenter on that gritty, influential picture, a world away in tone from the sunny optimism of The Last Starfighter. So the director of this hopeful space adventure had, within just a few years, worn the mask of a silent killer and helped create one of the coolest, most cynical action heroes of the decade. Nick Castle's fingerprints are on a genuinely eclectic run of cult classics, and The Last Starfighter was his chance to step fully into the director's chair for a story of pure heart. Here we reach the film's true historical significance. The groundbreaking space visuals in The Last Starfighter were not created with physical models and miniatures like nearly every science fiction film before it. They were generated by a computer, and not just any computer. The effects were rendered on a Cray XMP, which at the time was quite literally the fastest supercomputer in the entire world. This was a monster of a machine. The Cray XMP was a hugely expensive, cutting-edge piece of scientific hardware, reportedly weighing over 5 tons and running so hot that it required liquid coolant piped through a network of copper tubing just to keep it from overheating. The effects house Digital Productions was reportedly the first commercial company ever to acquire one of these behemoths, which had been designed for advanced scientific and government research rather than making movies. Turning a room-sized scientific supercomputer, a machine built for weather modeling and weapons research, toward the task of rendering alien dogfights was a genuinely radical, almost absurd idea in 1984, and it worked. Creating the film's computer imagery was a slow, painstaking, and nerve-wracking process, utterly unlike the instant digital tools of today. The Cray supercomputer was astonishingly powerful for its era, but rendering a single frame of complex, fully three-dimensional computer animation still demanded an enormous amount of processing time, with each frame reportedly taking hours to complete. This created a working rhythm that sounds almost unimaginable now. Artists would set up their shots and then essentially hand them over to the machine and wait, often arriving at work the next morning to discover for the first time whether the frames they had queued up overnight had rendered successfully or failed. The whole workflow rewarded patience, discipline, and meticulous planning because there was no quick preview, no instant feedback, and no room for casual trial and error. Every ship, every explosion, every maneuver existed purely as data, calculated laboriously by the computer rather than filmed. It was a grueling, high-stakes way to make a movie, pioneering techniques that the entire film industry would eventually adopt and refine. To understand just how ambitious The Last Starfighter was, you have to grasp the sheer quantity of computer-generated imagery it attempted. The film reportedly contains around 27 minutes of computer graphics spread across roughly 300 separate scenes. In 1984, that was an absolutely staggering, almost reckless amount of digital effects work for a single motion picture. For context, computers had barely been used for photorealistic movie imagery at all before this. Disney's Tron had broken ground 2 years earlier, but much of its computer imagery was relatively simple and stylized. The Last Starfighter pushed the technology dramatically further, using it to depict detailed, solid-looking spaceships and environments meant to feel real within a live-action story. Attempting nearly half an hour of such effects was a massive leap, essentially betting a large portion of the film on a technology that had never been asked to do this much. That scale is precisely why the film occupies such an important place in the history of visual effects, regardless of how primitive some of the imagery may look to modern eyes. For all its cosmic ambition, The Last Starfighter is grounded by its humble, distinctly American setting, the Starlight Starbright trailer court where Alex lives and dreams of something bigger. That location was a very deliberate choice by director Nick Castle, who wanted a specific emotional texture for his hero's ordinary world. Castle reportedly sought a setting that was insular, a little rundown, but ultimately charming, wholesome, and full of real Americana. The kind of humble place a restless kid would desperately want to escape while still loving the people in it. The trailer park perfectly captures that bittersweet feeling of small, hard scrabble beginnings. The film even underlines Alex's limited prospects with a quiet, relatable detail, showing him being turned down for a bank loan that would have helped pay for college. That grounding is a huge part of why the film works. Before it ever rockets into space, it makes you believe in an ordinary young man with big dreams and few options, so that his cosmic escape feels genuinely earned and joyful. In the story of how computer graphics conquered Hollywood, one film gets remembered constantly and another gets unfairly overlooked, despite the two being closely linked pioneers. Disney's Tron, released in 1982, is rightly celebrated as the movie that first brought extensive computer imagery to the screen. But The Last Starfighter, arriving 2 years later, deserves to stand right beside it, and in some technical respects, it went further. Where Tron used its computer world as a deliberately stylized, glowing, abstract environment, The Last Starfighter attempted something arguably harder, using computer graphics to create solid, realistic-looking spaceships and objects that had to coexist convincingly within an ordinary live-action adventure. It was trying to make the digital imagery feel real rather than dreamlike. The two films together represent the crucial opening chapter of the CGI revolution, the moment computers first seriously challenged models and miniatures. Yet while Tron enjoys enormous fame and a sequel, The Last Starfighter remains comparatively unsung, a quiet pioneer whose importance is often forgotten. It is, in every sense, the overlooked twin of the computer graphics revolution. Part of the reason for the imbalance in their reputations is simply branding. Tron was a Disney film with a bold, instantly iconic neon aesthetic and a whole world built around its digital concept, making its use of computers impossible to miss. The Last Starfighter, by contrast, tried to make its computer imagery blend in and pass as ordinary spaceship footage, which means its groundbreaking technique is precisely the thing casual viewers are least likely to notice. It was punished, in a sense, for succeeding at what it set out to do, quietly hiding its own revolution inside a modest, unassuming adventure film. Beneath its space opera trappings, The Last Starfighter is built on one of the most irresistible premises in all of science fiction, an idea so perfect it has resonated for decades. The whole story rests on the fantasy that the arcade game a kid obsessively masters is secretly a real recruitment test, and that being the best in the world at it means you have been training, all along, for something genuinely important, This is the ultimate daydream of every young person who ever poured quarters into a machine, the wish that all those hours were not wasted but were secretly preparing them for a heroic destiny. It taps directly into the hopes of an entire generation raised on video games, validating their passion in the most spectacular way imaginable. The idea proved so powerful and so prescient that it has echoed through pop culture ever since, anticipating a world in which gaming skill would become genuinely valuable and celebrated. The Last Starfighter gave shy, game-obsessed kids a movie that told them their obsession might just make them a hero. And that promise is a huge part of why the film is so deeply, enduringly beloved. While the film's computer graphics grab all the historical attention, one of its most enduring and beloved elements is something far more traditional: the soaring, adventurous orchestral score composed by Craig Safan. In an era of iconic space opera music, Safan's work has quietly earned a devoted following of its own. The music brilliantly balances sweeping adventure, tender romance, and wistful longing, giving the film an emotional grandeur that elevates every scene. Fans have championed it for decades as one of the great underappreciated science fiction scores, standing up proudly against the more famous soundtracks of its era. Its reputation has grown so much over the years that Safan's Last Starfighter music has been performed as full orchestral concert suites in various countries around the world, decades after the film's release, to audiences who genuinely love it. For a movie sometimes dismissed for its dated visuals, the fact that its music endures in living concert halls is a beautiful testament to how much heart and craft went into every part of the production. Despite its passionate cult following, its beloved premise, and its historical importance, The Last Starfighter spent an astonishingly long time as a story with no continuation. For decades, fans clamored for more, and various attempts at a sequel, a remake, and even a stage musical were floated over the years, with director Nick Castle himself trying at points to revive the property. None of them came together. Year after year, the follow-up remained trapped in development limbo, becoming one of the great long-awaited sequels that never seemed to arrive, a genuine white whale for fans of 80s science fiction. It was not until more than 4 decades after the original film that a direct continuation finally materialized, arriving in 2026 in the form of an official comic book sequel that picks up the story of Alex Rogan and the Star League. Waiting over 40 years for the next chapter of a story is a remarkable testament, both to the film's lasting devoted fanbase and to just how difficult it can be to recapture lightning in a bottle. It is difficult, from a modern vantage point, to appreciate just how enormous a risk The Last Starfighter took. When the filmmakers committed to rendering their space sequences with computer graphics instead of physical models, they were betting a huge portion of a major studio movie on a technology that had never been asked to carry this much weight. There was no proven playbook, no guarantee it would even work, and effectively no safety net. Unlike traditional effects, where a model that looks wrong can be relit and reshot in an afternoon, the computer imagery represented a massive, expensive commitment to an unproven pipeline. The contract with the effects company alone reportedly ran to millions of dollars, ballooning the budget, and if the ambitious digital approach had failed to convince audiences, there was no easy fallback since the whole film had been designed around it. The studio and filmmakers were essentially wagering the movie's success on the promise that a room full of scientists and a supercomputer could conjure believable spaceships out of pure mathematics. That leap of faith, that willingness to gamble on the future, is exactly what makes the film historically important. And here is why this modest, sometimes overlooked film genuinely matters. The Last Starfighter, alongside Tron, was one of the very first movies to prove that computer-generated imagery could replace physical models and depict spaceships, environments, and action on a grand scale. Every dazzling digital effect in the decades of blockbusters that followed traces part of its lineage back to bold early experiments like this one. The path runs directly from these pioneering films to the fully computer-generated dinosaurs of Jurassic Park, to the first entirely computer-animated feature in Toy Story, and onward to essentially every effects-driven movie made today. When a small crew wrestled a scientific supercomputer into rendering alien dogfights in 1984, they were helping to invent the visual language of modern cinema itself. The Gunstar became one of film's first fully digital heroes, a direct ancestor of everything from digital superheroes to entire computer-generated worlds. So, a charming little story about a trailer park kid and a video game turns out to be a genuine landmark in the history of the movies. One of the humble seeds from which the entire modern blockbuster grew. Not bad for The Last Starfighter. So, there you have it. 20 weird facts about a wholesome space adventure directed by a man who once played Michael Myers, starring the Music Man in his farewell role, advertising a video game that never existed, and hiding 2 future Star Trek actors in its margins. Behind its sunny charm, it wrestled the fastest computer on Earth into rendering a war among the stars.